This is Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. Make sure that you subscribe to our Substack so you don't miss any episodes. The 1-6 committee left this out, and it is a BFD. The lead investigator for the 1-6 committee says that the domestic terrorist attack that took place at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, could have been prevented. A lead investigator for the 1-6 House Select Committee determined that the inadequate defense of the U.S. Capitol wasn't due to a lack of knowledge, but rather a failure to act on intelligence that they received. They had knowledge, but chose not to act. The House Select January 6th Committee had to make choices about what to focus on in its televised hearings. And they chose to focus on Trump World's role in inciting the attempted self-coup / domestic terrorist attack. But they left out some vital information about the failure of law enforcement to act on a large volume of advanced tips. They left this out of the final report as well, and that raises a lot of questions that we are not likely to get answers to as long as Republicans are in charge of the House. The House January 6th Committee concluded that the FBI and other federal security agencies could have prevented a violent mob from overrunning the Capitol had they acted on the large volume of intelligence collected beforehand. The chief investigator told NBC News this in an exclusive interview, a judgment the committee left out of its televised hearings and final report. The lead investigator said that he also agrees with Washington, D.C.'s National Guard commander, who told the committee the response would have been much different before and during the attack, quote, if these protesters were black and brown, unquote. This is all that I'm reading you from NBC's exclusive with this lead investigator. They determined that the inadequate defense of the U.S. Capitol wasn't due to a lack of knowledge, but rather a failure to act on intelligence that had warned that extremists were coming to Washington to use violence to stop the certification of Joe Biden's victory. There was a lot of intelligence about law enforcement, about carrying weapons, about the vulnerability of the Capitol, the lead investigator told NBC. The intel in advance was pretty specific, and it was enough, in our view, for law enforcement to have done a better job. So here's an example of the kinds of tips that got ignored. An FBI tipster in December 2020 reported, and this is kind of important, under types of tips, attempted coup, terrorist attack on January 6th. I don't know, it seems like if you were in law enforcement, that would have been a really big clue, and I'm sure they have flags set up for those keywords. And here's the quote of this tipster, so, brace yourself. It's just stunning. It's stunning, and I think very troubling. They think that they will have a large enough group to march into D.C. armed and will outnumber the police so they can't be stopped. They believe that since the election was, quote, stolen, unquote, that it's their constitutional right to overtake the government, and during this coup, no U.S. laws apply. Their plan is to literally kill people. Please, please take this tip seriously and investigate further. The tipster also linked to the actual plans for the attack, the online plans. They linked to those plans. They gave the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, several links, in fact, to where the plans for this attack were posted online. The tipster said they planned to overtake the White House and they would be armed. The tip form asks if there are known associates. The tipster has an answer for that as well, and it won't surprise you. Donald Trump, Proud Boys, believe that Trump called them into action by telling them to go to D.C. on January 6th and act, quote, wild, unquote. The group that is organizing the attack is the Proud Boys terrorist group. So, even for an agency that must get a lot of reports, this seems like a huge miss. And the lead investigator said there was a large volume of reports. So this is but one tip. I think, just go back to the previous comment. If these people had not been acting on behalf of Donald Trump, if they were not white, the response would have been a lot different. But I think even that is missing perhaps an even larger implication of this, because there was that memo reported in the fall of 2021 demonstrating how Homeland Security suddenly decided to control and restrict the flow of election-related threats to law enforcement ahead of 1/6. Now, this was reported in fall of 2021, but obviously the memo was just months before the actual attack on the Capitol. CNN reported this on September 14th, 2021. A few months before rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol, the Department of Homeland Security restricted the flow of open-source intelligence reports about the election-related threats to law enforcement, citing First Amendment concerns, according to documents reviewed by CNN. Now, hope you're sitting down, because you may recall this was brought up in objections earlier, but I think in light of what this lead investigator said, it looks even more stunning now. But that staffer who made that call, the guy who sent the order to restrict the flow of election-related threats, he also served on the House January 6th committee. Joseph Maher, who changed protocols around disseminating open-source information as head of DHS's intelligence arm, is now on the staff of the House Select Committee on January 6th. We discussed the suppression of information and downplaying of the troubling connections between Trump and the Russians in the Russia investigation. We talked about that last week on the podcast. One aspect that we're still going to dig into on that was the failure of law enforcement, given the arrest for that lead, the man in charge of counterintelligence at the New York FBI office, where tips went to die, given his arrest for allegedly working for the Russian he was supposed to have been investigating before he retired. So let's just take all this information together. Let's put these different investigations, right? So, but let's take all these threads that are all talking about the established suppression of information that was damaging to Trump. And let's view this along with this lead investigator saying, again, the intel in advance was pretty specific, and it was enough, in our view, for law enforcement to have done a better job. We know that under Trump, the Department of Homeland Security deliberately and with no legitimate reason cited, especially given that administration's contempt for the First Amendment. I just cannot, I refuse to give that legitimacy. And I'm not, I think if anyone is going to argue that they were pro-First Amendment, they're going to have to cite a lot of instances of that to counter what are known facts that took place under the Trump administration and the weaponization of law enforcement against people exercising their First Amendment when Trump was against what they were protesting. So it's also apparent that the 1-6 committee put Maher in charge of investigating intelligence dissemination failures that occurred, as the critics pointed out in the CNN piece, under his leadership. So this is 2 times that we know of, and that's not including the scourge of Trump protector Bill Barr weaponizing the DOJ for Trump and hiding potential criminal tips about Trump's financial dealings, in which someone has been put in a position of oversight or investigation into matters in which they are possibly compromised or at the very least incapable of impartiality. The 1-6 committee says that Maher recused himself from these matters, but, I think it's fair to ask, given their seeming bearing of this pertinent information about law enforcement not acting on large volumes of tips, why? Why did they make that decision? Government is always full of corruption, like all entities, and that's why oversight is so important. But it's also true that Trump took corruption to heretofore unseen heights. His ability to corrupt the DOJ, the FBI offices, and the Department of Homeland Security should be investigated and prioritized with legislation to keep this from ever happening again. The Republican-led House won't do that, but don't let their lack of patriotism stop you from demanding that they do their jobs. This is Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. If you are tired of billionaires controlling the news you see, and you really want to be a part of something, a part of a movement to elevate and support independent news that puts the people first, please subscribe to our Substack. It is free. We do appreciate everyone who pays for these subscriptions. That does help us keep the website open and not behind a paywall. Thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to talking with you next time.